Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are diving deep into Angola.
Right.
Now, if you ever heard about Angola, maybe it's been in the news related to oil or perhaps some past conflict.
That's often the case.
But the source material you've shared with us, well, it reveals a history that is incredibly rich, long, and frankly, often pretty tumultuous.
It really does. It gives us a picture of a territory that's been, a crossroads, cultures, conflict, global forces going back thousands of years.
So our mission in this deep dive is really to go through these sources together. Let's try and pull out the key nuggets of knowledge.
Exactly. And understand not just what happened in Angola's past.
So why it happened, right? And how that history is still shaping the country today.
Precisely. We're going on a journey, essentially. We'll start way, way back.
Okay.
Explore these powerful pre-colonial kingdoms, then get into the really devastating era of the slave trade and colonization, witness the fight for independence, that long, brutal civil war, and then land in the complex, sort of paradoxical situation of contemporary Angola.
It sounds like a journey that reveals some pretty profound truths about identity, power, and just the incredibly long shadow history can cast.
That's a good way to put it.
All right, let's start right at the beginning then, because the history here, the human presence, it goes back surprisingly far. The sources take us back to the Upper Stone Age.
Yeah, they do. The sources indicate human activity dating back at least 15,000 years ago, Homo sapiens settling in the area.
Wow.
And there are even older hominid traces suggesting presence maybe reaching back 1,000,000 years. It's a land with seriously deep roots.
15,000 years of Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
That's just a vast stretch of history. And it wasn't static, I assume. Agriculture must have changed things significantly.
Oh, absolutely. The development of settled agriculture, animal husbandry around 250 BC, that's the early Iron Age, that was really pivotal.
How so?
Well, that shift allowed for more stability, food surplus. And that, in turn, led to social stratification. So you start to see the emergence of chiefs, kings, courts, these early administrative systems. They really laid the groundwork for the larger political entities that came later.
So who are the people living there in those really early societies before, outsiders arrived?
Well, long before European contact, the area was home to communities like the Khoi and San peoples.
Right.
And the sources note that Angolans today, they still carry that ancient ancestry. It goes back at least 25,000 years, genetically speaking.
Incredible. But the groups that became more dominant politically, the ones who formed the big kingdoms later on, they were the Bantu speakers.
That's right. Bantu speakers started migrating from West Africa around 300 BCE, maybe even earlier.
Right.
And by about 100 CE, they'd become pretty dominant throughout the territory. These were primarily agriculturalist tribes, quite diverse, but sharing, linguistic and cultural links.
And by the 15th century, just before the Portuguese show up, we're seeing significant kingdoms emerge.
Indeed. Powerful kingdoms like Congo up in the north, Ndongo, Angola. And here's a really crucial point the sources highlight.
What's that?
Some of these kingdoms, they were already involved in internal trade networks that included capturing and trading people as servants.
Ah, okay. So pre-European slave trade, in a sense.
Well, servant trading is perhaps a better term initially. This practice, centered in areas like the Kwanzaa River Basin, it existed from the 1480s, even before the large-scale Atlantic trade really took off.
That's a really key piece of context, isn't it? That there was an existing system, maybe smaller scale, but existing, that the later European-driven trade could sort of latch onto and massively expand.
Exactly. It wasn't created out of nothing. Now, culturally, these pre-colonial societies...
And so were they like?
The sources describe this land of diverse Bantu tribes, mostly focused on farming, but with complex social hierarchies, established trade routes connecting different regions, and tributary relationships, smaller groups paying tribute to larger kingdoms like the formidable Chokwe Empire or the Congo Kingdom.
Right.
And what's fascinating is that many of these fundamental cultural variables, these relationships, they actually persisted somehow, even through the massive disruptions that came later.
There's resilience. But you mentioned something about how we even know this history, a potential bias.
Yes, and it's an important one. The sources point out that much of the recorded history, especially from the pre-colonial period, it's been written from a very Eurocentric perspective.
Right, written by the colonizers, basically.
Often, yes. And that approach frequently denied or at least minimized the full expression and complexity of Angola's own story, its own agency. Understanding that bias is really essential when we interpret the historical accounts we have.
Makes total sense.
Mm-hmm.
Hard to get the full picture when someone else is holding the pen, as they say.
Hmm.
Which leads us directly to the arrival of Europeans and, well, the immense dark shadow of the slave trade.
Yeah, this period marks a dramatic and truly devastating turning point. The Portuguese, they were following Henry the Navigator's push for exploration. They reached the River Zaire, the Congo, in the 15th century, and they quickly discovered resources they could exploit: ivory and, critically, captives for forced labor, slaves.
And this slave trade, it didn't just sort of happen on the side, it became central, right?
Absolutely central. The sources are very clear on this. The trade started around the Congo River mouth, but it rapidly moved south with the Portuguese influence and establishment.
Like to Luanda.
Exactly. With the founding of Luanda in 1575, the slave trade became a main element, maybe the main element of the local economy. And it stayed that way right through until the late 19th century. It wasn't a side business. It was foundational to the colonial economy there.
And where were these millions of enslaved people primarily sent? It's horrifying to think about the scale.
Primarily, they were destined for the vast sugar plantations in the Caribbean islands. Brazil, too, of course, another Portuguese colony.
Right.
There were even attempts, the sources mentioned by the Portuguese, to set up sugar plantations near Luanda itself. But over the centuries, millions upon millions were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. It fundamentally reshaped societies on both continents.
By the 19th century, did the trade picture change at all? Did it diversify as abolitionist pressure grew elsewhere?
Yes, somewhat. The sources do note that while the slave trade remained significant for a very long time, Angolan trade also began to include other commodities. Things like palm oil, ivory, wild rubber became more important during the 19th century.
But the legacy of centuries of just this massive forced extraction of people must have had a profound impact inside Angola, right, on the societies themselves.
Oh, immense, lasting repercussions. It completely reshaped the internal dynamics. It influenced alliances between different groups. It fueled conflicts as groups raided each other for captives to sell.
Great.
It created new, often distorted trade patterns within the territory. The sources give a pretty striking example: how access to this quick trade, primarily through captives, could just devastatingly alter societies that were previously focused on agriculture, pushing them towards becoming, say, warrior cultures or cattle herding cultures because that facilitated raiding and trade. They mentioned groups like the Kwanyama, the Congo, the Lunda being affected this way.
That insight is powerful, how external forces didn't just take resources out, but fundamentally rewired the internal social and economic structures. That's profound.
It really is.
And this internal landscape, shaped by centuries of the slave trade, it sort of set the stage for the next big external pressure cooker, the scramble for Africa in the mid-19th century.
Exactly. As the European powers were carving up the continent, Portugal aimed to consolidate its claim over this vast territory we now call Angola. And here's where those existing internal divisions became absolutely critical.
How so?
The sources really highlight this: the deep fissures, the rivalries between different tribes and groups which were long present but definitely exacerbated by the slave trade. They were cleverly taken advantage of by the Portuguese. They played groups off against each other, subjugated some tribes, gained cooperation from others by helping them against their rivals. It made the Portuguese expansion inland much easier than it might have been.
So a history of these internally created, or at least intensified, divisions made the whole region more vulnerable to deeper colonial control. That connection between the slave trade's legacy and successful colonization is just stark.
It's a direct line, according to these sources.
Okay, let's move into that formal colonial era then, under Portugal.
Right. So formal Portuguese control really starts solidifying with Luanda in 1575. But the expansion inland was gradual. It took centuries, really, using conquest and exploiting those divisions we just talked about.
That's nearly 400 years under colonial rule. What was that actually like for the majority of Angolans?
Well, for centuries, it was dominated by the slave trade, as we said, even after formal abolition in 1869, which took time to actually implement. While there was some limited industrialization, maybe some railways built for resource extraction, the colonial administration profoundly neglected development for the native population. Infrastructure, basic services, and especially education were severely lacking.
So prospects for change must have seemed pretty bleak for most people before, say, the mid-20th century.
Extremely bleak. But then things started to shift, slowly at first, then more rapidly after World War II.
What changed?
A couple of things. Changes initiated, ironically, under the Portuguese Salazar dictatorship back in Europe, combined with this huge wave of decolonization sweeping across Africa in the 1950s and 60s.
Right, the winds of change.
Exactly. All this fueled the rise of Angolan nationalist movements, groups determined to end Portuguese rule, finally.
And the sources introduced the three key organizations that would really dominate this struggle and ultimately the country's future.
Yes, three main liberation movements emerged, and their rivalry is central to the story.
Okay, who were they?
First, you have the MPLA. That's the Movimento Popular de Libertação de Angola. Formed in 1956, a merger of smaller groups. The source describes it as Marxist-Leninist, ideologically, with a pretty radical program.
And their support base.
They had the largest support base, it seems, particularly among urban mesticos, people of mixed Angolan and European heritage, and also in some other key areas. Militarily, they proved to be the most successful, eventually. And crucially, they got significant backing from the Soviet Union, Cuba, and North Vietnam.
Okay, MPLA. Who's next?
Then there was the FNLA, the Frente Nacional de Libertação de Angola, led by Holden Roberto. This group initially formed as the UPA back in 1960.
And their base.
Their base was primarily among pro-Bakongo elites, especially those linked to the old Congo kingdom. Many were actually in exile in Leopoldville, which is now Kinshasa in the DRC. The sources note they initially had maybe less core support inside Angola compared to the MPLA, and they relied quite a bit on external connections, U.S. intelligence contacts, American sponsors, support from Zaire. Their focus was on opposing white rule and defending indigenous political structures, particularly Bakongo ones.
Okay, MPLA, FNLA, and the third one.
UNITA, the Unión Nacional para a Independencia Total de Angola, also formed around 1960. Interestingly, the source says it was formed in the U.S. initially.
Really?
Yeah. Its main support base became the Ovimbundu people, a major ethnic group in Angola's Central Highlands. Like the others, UNITA sought to oppose colonial rule and racial repression.
So you've got these three distinct movements, different ethnic or social bases, different ideologies, different international backers, all fighting the Portuguese, but also presumably eyeing each other.
Absolutely, vying for eventual control. And the whole situation just got thrown into hyperdrive by an event back in Portugal itself.
Right. You mentioned that earlier, the Carnation Revolution.
Exactly. April 1974, this coup in Lisbon overthrows the dictatorship, and boom, Portugal's whole colonial policy changes overnight.
How so?
It basically guaranteed elections in the colonies and set a timetable for independence. For Angola, independence was scheduled relatively quickly, November 12, 1975.
Wow, that's fast. Independence Day suddenly on the horizon, with three rival movements. I can only imagine it became a desperate race for power.
A very intense and very bloody competition is how the source puts it. The rivalry just escalated incredibly rapidly in the lead up to that date.
So what happened on Independence Day?
Well, on November 11th, 1975, the day before the official date, the MPLA, controlling Luanda, unilaterally declared independence.
Ah, okay, so independence arrived, but maybe not the unified celebration people hoped for. It sounds like the moment was immediately overshadowed.
Tragically, yes. Decolonization brought hope, genuine hope for self-determination. But that hope was immediately drowned out by civil war. And it wasn't just a continuation of the anti-colonial struggle, it became even more ferocious in the years that followed.
And those deep-seated rivalries between the MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA, they must have just exploded and pulled in those external powers even more directly.
Instantly. The internal conflict triggered massive international intervention. The Angolan Civil War became a classic textbook Cold War proxy war.
So the battle lines were drawn internationally.
Very clearly. The USA and the Western Bloc, along with South Africa and Zaire, largely backed UNITA and the FNLA, especially UNITA, because of its strong anti-communist stance.
And the other side?
The USSR, Cuba, and the Eastern Bloc threw significant military and financial support behind the MPLA government in Luanda. Cuba even sent tens of thousands of troops.
This just sounds like an absolute catastrophe for the Angolan people caught right in the middle of this superpower struggle being fought on their land.
It was utterly devastating. The sources talk about a conflict where hundreds of thousands died, millions became refugees, either internally displaced within Angola or fleeing to neighboring countries like Namibia and Zambia.
Just unimaginable suffering.
And the war didn't just kill and displace, it radically reshaped everything social life. people's historical experience, their very perceptions of their country, their neighbors, their future.
Beyond the obvious Cold War ideological clash, were there other major drivers keeping this conflict going for so long?
Oh, absolutely. The source makes it very clear that while ideology was a factor, a huge, persistent driver of the war was the fight for control over Angola's vast natural resources.
Oil and diamonds, I presume.
Primarily, yes. Oil along the coast, largely controlled by the MPLA government, and diamonds in the interior, often controlled or contested by UNITA. These were incredibly lucrative sources of foreign cash, and all sides coveted them to buy weapons and fund their war efforts.
So it wasn't just about Marxists versus anti-communists. It was also a brutal fight for resource wealth. And this conflict wasn't short-lived, was it?
No, not at all. It became one of the longest and bloodiest civil wars anywhere in Africa. It dragged on with brief pauses and failed peace deals for nearly 3 decades.
3 decades.
It only officially ended in 2002, and that was really only because the longtime leader of UNITA, Jonas Savimbi, was finally killed in battle.
Wow. And the source also mentioned that this conflict didn't stay neatly within Angola's borders. It spilled over.
Yes, definitely. The Angolan Civil War got tangled up with other regional conflicts, especially fights over resources like those diamond mines. Countries like the DRC, Rwanda, Uganda, Zimbabwe, they all got involved at different times, sometimes backing different factions in Angola, sometimes pursuing their own interests linked to the war. It created this complex, messy web of regional instability, all connected back to the Angolan War.
So, just recapping, a long, incredibly brutal war, fueled by internal rivalries going way back, layered with Cold War ideology, fierce competition for oil and diamonds in these complex regional power plays. What was the lasting impact of all that conflict on Angolan society itself?
The impact, well, it goes so much deeper than just the political outcome or the military statistics. The sources describe these profound, lasting social wounds.
Like what?
You see a population described as deeply affected. The source uses phrases like blinded and angry. A pervasive sense of inadequacy among people who felt powerless to rebuild their lives. And just deep-seated resentment and hatred left over from the violence and betrayals. It's a society profoundly marked by trauma.
What about the tangible legacies and the intangible ones?
Tangibly, the war left behind this enormous state apparatus, a lot of infrastructure often built by foreign backers and a very large military, which reflects just how many countries were involved in arming the different sides.
Right.
Intangibly, though, it fostered an entrenched ruling class, often described as an oligopoly. Widespread corruption became endemic, systems of surveillance, organized crime networks. And maybe most disturbingly, a political mentality that often sought the annihilation of opponents, not just, defeating them politically.
That sounds incredibly harsh. The source details some specific human costs too, right? Those are tough to read.
They are harrowing. The source talks about specific impacts like border areas becoming essentially lawless zones, cities like Huambo and Huila, even parts of Luanda, being subjected to sieges, bombardment with long-range artillery.
Oh my.
Forced resettlement of populations, clandestine prisons, torture, forced disappearances, collective punishment. These weren't isolated incidents. They became enduring experiences for countless Angolans during those decades.
And the massive displacement, millions of people forced from their homes, that must have had its own set of consequences beyond just losing property.
Absolutely. Millions displaced led to this scattering of peoples and cultural traditions. It uprooted entire communities from their ancestral lands, their specific dialects. It caused the disintegration of kinship systems, which were really the fundamental social glue in many areas.
Luanda itself, the capital, seems like it was completely overwhelmed by the war's aftermath.
Yes, the source paints a really vivid picture. Describes Luanda after the Portuguese left and during the war as a desperate, uncontrolled nesting space for refugees. Just waves of people fleeing the fighting in the countryside.
And the physical scars.
Starkly visible. For years, Angola held the tragic distinction of having one of the highest rates of landmine injuries per capita anywhere in the world. The sight of amputees begging on the streets was, for a long time, a common, painful, everyday reminder of the war's physical legacy.
Is there much public processing of this immense trauma today? Any kind of national reckoning?
This is a really significant point the sources make. There's a notable lack of public discourse about the Civil War, especially in Luanda. There hasn't been a comprehensive national reconciliation policy, not like you saw in, say, South Africa or Rwanda.
Really? Why not?
It's complex, likely tied to the fact that one side, the MPLA, definitively won the war and remains in power. This leads to what the source calls a kind of national amnesia, a silencing of the recent painful past in public life and in a lot of mainstream cultural production. Though it's important to note, the source does say some critical art has emerged, challenging that silence.
So a trauma that's deeply felt individually and collectively, but largely unaddressed at the public national level, that's a really heavy legacy to carry into the present day.
It absolutely is.
Okay, let's shift then to contemporary Angola, since the official end of the Civil War in 2002. What's the official status now?
Officially, Angola is a unitary presidential constitutional republic. They operate under a constitution adopted in 2010. And yes, the war formally ended with Jonas Savimbi's death back in 2002.
But what does the political reality look like on the ground today, beyond the official structures?
Well, the source describes a system that, while it has the structures of a multi-party democracy, there are registered opposition parties, it functions much more like what political scientists call competitive authoritarianism in practice. Meaning the MPLA, the party that declared independence back in '75, has maintained its dominance ever since, including the very long rule of José Eduardo dos Santos, who was president until 2017.
Right.
And even with some reforms under his successor, João Lourenço, the sources indicate that deep-rooted corruption schemes have persisted. The media faces restrictions, public protests are often suppressed. It shows the real limits on genuine political openness.
And there's that striking economic paradox the sources highlighted earlier.
Yes, this is absolutely central to understanding Angola today. The country is incredibly rich. Massive oil reserves, diamonds, other minerals, huge potential for agriculture, other natural resources.
Sounds like it should be wealthy.
You'd think so. Yet, despite this immense potential, despite favorable conditions for food production, the sources point out persistent, widespread food insecurity. Nearly half the population, they say, relies on foreign aid for food.
How is that possible? It sounds like a profound paradox.
It is presented as a profound paradox, and one that decades of foreign assistance haven't resolved, and maybe, the sources hint, have even exacerbated in some ways by creating dependency or distorting local markets.
After decades of war, though, massive reconstruction must have been needed, right?
Oh, a monumental task. And there have been massive reconstruction efforts since 2002. Economic growth did occur, especially during the oil boom years.
Fueled by oil money.
Largely, yes, and often leveraged by the ruling party's control over those resources. Luanda, the capital, saw this unprecedented building boom. The skyline transformed, but it also became one of the most expensive cities in the world to live in.
But despite the growth, the new buildings, it sounds like significant challenges clearly remain underneath.
Definitely. The sources point to ongoing struggles, resolving deep-seated problems around land ownership, particularly contested urban land versus rural needs. Huge economic disparities between the elite and the majority. Persistent challenges in just meeting basic social needs, quality education, healthcare for all.
And politically.
The difficulty of genuinely democratizing the political system, and maybe most fundamentally, the challenge of grappling with those violent memories of the past and trying to forge some kind of shared vision for the nation moving forward when there are still competing ideas about what that nation should be.
What about Angola's role in the region?
Yeah.
And globally?
Angola is a significant player in southern Africa, no question, largely because of its oil wealth, which gives it financial clout, and also its relatively powerful military, which has shown a willingness to intervene in neighboring countries' conflicts in the past.
And further afield, international partners.
Externally, China has become a particularly important partner, a major donor, funding a lot of that post-war infrastructure reconstruction, often surpassing traditional partners like the U.S. or European countries in terms of investment.
Interesting shift.
Yeah. Angola has definitely sought to gain more regional and global legitimacy since the war ended. It faces challenges, perceptions around transparency, corruption, but the sources also note there's been some acknowledged progress in tackling those issues, at least on paper.
Any other specific foreign relationships mentioned?
Yes, Brazil comes up. Historical ties, Portuguese language connection. Brazil was one of the first to recognize Angola's independence. There's also a partnership cooperation agreement with the EU and ongoing strong strategic ties with the former colonizer, Portugal.
How do those work?
The sources note they often act as sort of gateways for each other. Angola provides Portugal access into parts of Africa, Portugal provides Angola access into Europe, and political business groups on both sides play a big role in shaping those economic relationships.
Okay, so a nation grappling with just immense layered problems.
Yeah.
Legacies of exploitation, conflict, navigating political control, these deep economic paradoxes. But the sources also pointed to something that feels almost like a counter-narrative, this idea of a cultural renaissance.
Yes, and it's fascinating. It's part of that paradoxical character of post-colonial Angola. You see this really vibrant cultural life developing alongside, and sometimes in spite of, these tremendous social, political, and economic problems.
How did that cultural scene even develop, given that the colonial past, as you said, neglected education and things like theater?
Right. Decades of Portuguese rule deliberately deprived Angola of a modern education system, institutions of, high culture, like formal theater.
Huh.
So independence wasn't just about politics. It was the starting point for trying to build those things from the ground up.
A slow process, I imagine.
Very slow. Basic cultural structures started emerging a few years after independence. By the mid-'80s, even amidst the war, you started seeing the beginnings of a professional theater scene in Luanda, attempts at opera, symphonic orchestras, institutions like a National Museum of Histories taking shape. It takes time, it takes trained people, but the process began, driven by Angolans themselves.
And has this cultural output gained recognition outside Angola?
The sources note that yes, despite all the challenges, post-colonial Angola has produced internationally well-regarded individuals, institutions, cultural events in music, literature, visual arts.
The source also specifically highlighted design and cultural industries.
It did, yeah. It mentions this sort of spontaneous emergence and training of designers in film, theater production, graphic design. This is seen as a really positive sign, maybe a form of positive globalization, integrating international trends with local culture, fostering the growth of creative industries. It really speaks to a resilient creative spirit that persists, even flourishes, despite the incredibly difficult historical context and ongoing challenges.
So even amidst all the deep scars, the ongoing struggles, there's this vibrant, forward-looking creative energy. That's a really powerful part of the picture of Angola today.
It's absolutely a testament to the complexity and maybe the resilience of the country and its people.
Okay, wow. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground here, really guided by the source material you provided us. We've traced Angola's story from its earliest inhabitants, these powerful pre-colonial kingdoms,
Right, way back.
through the truly devastating impact of the transatlantic slave trade and centuries of colonial rule. We've looked at the brutal struggle for independence, that prolonged internationalized civil war, fueled by internal rivalries and external superpowers,
A real tragedy.
leading us right up to the complex reality today. A resource-rich nation still grappling with deep poverty, issues of corruption, the profound wounds of its past, but also, as you just said, experiencing this significant cultural rebirth.
It truly is a story defined by those deep layers and significant paradoxes. You see it everywhere.
Yeah, that paradox.
Yeah.
Immense potential resources, yet widespread food insecurity, dependence on aid, a political system with democratic structures on paper, but struggling under entrenched power, maybe even that annihilation mentality towards opposition you mentioned, and a society scarred by trauma, division, yet somehow fostering this vibrant, creative, cultural scene.
Exactly. All these things exist at the same time.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me, looking back at everything. This deep dive, especially drawing on the sources, it just reveals so clearly how historical events, particularly that legacy of external exploitation, layered onto existing internal dynamics.
Like the slave trade being used by colonial powers.
Right, and then the enduring rivalries among the liberation movements themselves. How those things create these deeply ingrained patterns that continue to shape the nation's path, its politics, its social fabric, long after formal independence.
It really shows us that the past isn't just, over and done with. It actively lives on in the present structures, the challenges people face, the societal dynamics.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought, maybe something for you, the listener, to consider, drawing directly from the source material here.
Yeah.
The sources suggest that these deep-seated tribal or ethnic rivalries, and what one source explicitly calls a kind of revenge mechanism built into the political factions, that these have historically blocked reconciliation efforts and the development of genuine loyalty to the state itself rather than just a group or party.
That transition is tough.
Right. It argues that the transition from those older traditional allegiances to a unified national identity is still very much in progress, and maybe sometimes takes distorted forms because of the conflict history.
That makes sense.
So as you reflect on Angola's incredibly complex, often painful story, how does that interplay between historical ethnic identities, the immense trauma of conflict, and the ongoing challenges of building a unified modern state? How does that resonate with the experiences of other nations you might know about? And what does Angola's story suggest, more broadly, about just how fragile, how complex the whole project of nation building itself really is?